She burst into the bar in a tattered red dress, her small feet pounding against the floor as she fled a predator who was just seconds behind her. What young Emily Carter didn't know was that she had just run into the private sanctuary of the most dangerous man in New Jersey. Alessandro Duca sat just a few feet away, a mountain of quiet power watching through a cloud of cigar smoke. When she reached out to grab his sleeve, she wasn't just looking for a place to hide, she was changing the fate of the city's underworld forever. It was a rain-slicked evening in a private, dimly lit bar where the unspoken rules were simple. You minded your own business, and you never, ever caused a scene. This was Alessandro Duca's domain, a place where powerful men conducted business in the shadows and children were never seen. But when a terrified American girl shattered that silence, screaming for help from a pervert on her heels, she unknowingly stepped into the world of a man who believed sentiment was a liability. Alessandro was a boss who ruled through a cold stare and calculated control. But the sight of Emily's pure fear was about to crack the walls around his heart. What happened next would not only dismantle a corrupt trafficking ring, but reveal a side of the Mafia boss that the world thought had died decades ago. In the dim, amber-hued light of the Iron Gate, the air was thick with the scent of aged bourbon and the expensive, heavy aroma of Alessandro Duca's hand-rolled cigars. It was a space defined by a silence so profound it felt heavy, a sanctuary where the chaos of the New Jersey streets was muffled by thick oak doors and velvet curtains. Here, Alessandro sat in his usual leather chair, a man who looked less like a criminal and more like a king in exile. At 53, his presence was a physical weight in the room, his sharp, unreadable face carved from decades of calculated moves and hard-won respect. The Duca Code was the invisible architecture of this room. Every man present, from the bartender who moved with ghostly discretion to the lieutenants sitting in low-toned conference, understood the hierarchy. You did not speak unless spoken to, you never let your eyes linger too long on the boss, and above all, you never brought the messiness of the outside world into his domain. Alessandro operated on the fundamental truth that sentiment was a weakness, a flaw he had surgically removed from his soul 30 years ago after the world had taken everything he loved. To the men in his circle, Alessandro was an enigma of surgical precision. He divided territories and settled disputes with a few quiet words that carried the force of law. His dark eyes missed nothing, scanning the room not with heat, but with the cold, methodical observation of a predator who had already won. He had survived by building walls of iron around his heart, ensuring that no one could ever find a point of leverage against him again. On this particular evening, the clink of ice against crystal was the only rhythm, a steady heartbeat for an empire built on fear and silence. Alessandro exhaled a slow, gray plume of smoke, his posture relaxed, but his mind as sharp as a blade. He was a man who believed he was untouchable, existing in a world where he was the final authority. He didn't know that the ironclad rules of his life were about to be shattered by the smallest of hands, or that the code he lived by was about to be tested by a fear far more primal than his own. The heavy oak door of the Iron Gate didn't just open, it was shoved, the brass hinges groaning in protest as the cold New Jersey rain sprayed into the warm amber sanctuary. Every glass in the room stopped mid-clink, and the low hum of business died instantly. Emily, still clutching Alessandro's sleeve with trembling fingers, let out a small, strangled gasp and tried to crawl further behind his heavy leather chair. She was a splash of tattered red against the dark mahogany, her wide eyes fixed on the doorway with a terror that surpassed the fear of the Mafia boss himself. A man stepped into the light, his breathing heavy and his face twisted in a mask of frustrated entitlement. He didn't look like the powerful men who usually frequented this establishment. He looked like a man who preyed on the weak because he was too small to face the strong. He stood in the entryway, blinking against the dim light, unaware that he had just stepped into a lion's den. He didn't see the way Alessandro's bodyguards shifted their weight, their hands moving instinctively toward their jackets, or the way the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The brat!" the man barked, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, nervous energy. "She belongs to me. She ran out of the house, and I'm here to take her back." He took a step forward, scanning the room until his gaze landed on the small, shivering figure hiding behind Alessandro's shadow. He didn't look at the man in the chair yet. He was too focused on his prize, his fingers twitching as if he could already feel the girl's arm back in his grasp. "Come here, Emily, now. You're causing a scene, and you know what happens when you make me angry." The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of quiet that precedes a landslide. Alessandro didn't move. He sat perfectly still, a single trail of cigar smoke curling around his sharp, unreadable face. His dark eyes remained fixed on the intruder, cataloging the man's cheap bravado and the frantic, predatory hunger in his expression. "You're in the wrong place to be demanding anything," one of the lieutenants said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. But the predator, blinded by his own obsession, ignored him. He pointed a shaking finger toward the back of Alessandro's chair. "I don't care who you people are. That girl is my property. Give her to me and I'll be out of your hair." He took another step, his boots tracking muddy rainwater across the pristine floor, oblivious to the fact that he was breaking every unspoken rule of the DeLuca domain. The air in the bar didn't just turn cold, it turned lethal. Alessandro DeLuca took a final, slow draw from his cigar, the cherry glowing a fierce, mocking orange in the gloom. He exhaled the smoke with a deliberate calmness that made the intruder's frantic shouting feel like the buzzing of a fly. Then, with a fluid, terrifying grace that belied his age, Alessandro stood up. The movement was subtle, yet it shifted the entire gravity of the room. As he rose to his full height, his tailored dark suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the amber light, the predator's bravado began to leak out of him like air from a punctured tire. For the first time, the man looked past the girl and truly saw the person he was addressing. He saw the expensive watch, the heavy gold signet ring, and most importantly, the eyes. Eyes that had watched empires rise and fall without a flicker of remorse. "Property?" Alessandro's voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried to every corner of the room. He didn't raise his tone, yet it felt as though he had shouted. He stepped around the leather chair, placing himself directly between the trembling child and the man who hunted her. "You come into my house, track filth across my floor, and speak of property?" The intruder swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the sudden silence. He took a half step back, his eyes darting to the heavy-set men closing in from the shadows of the bar. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't followed Emily into a public space, he had followed her into a fortress. He was no longer the hunter. I didn't know," the man stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. I'm her foster father. I have the papers. I have the right." "You have nothing," Alessandro interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. He took one more step forward, looming over the man. The scent of expensive tobacco and quiet danger overwhelmed the smell of the wet rain. Alessandro tilted his head, his cold stare dissecting the coward before him. "In this city, the only rights that exist are the ones I allow, and I find that I do not like the way you speak to children." Alessandro reached out, not to strike, but to straighten the intruder's damp collar with a terrifyingly gentle touch. The man began to shake, his knees buckling. He looked into Alessandro's unreadable face and finally understood that he was no longer dealing with a man, but with a beast who wore a suit, a beast that was now looking at him with a hunger for justice. The predator's knees finally gave way, and he collapsed into a heap on the floor, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. Alessandro didn't spare him a second glance. Instead, the Mafia boss turned back to the small girl huddled behind his chair. The transition was jarring. The lethal predator who had just loomed over the intruder now softened his stance, kneeling with a measured, heavy grace until he was at eye level with Emily. "Look at me, Piccola," Alessandro said, his voice dropping the rasp of steel for something unexpectedly gentle. "He cannot touch you here, but I need to know why a girl in a red dress is running through the rain alone." Emily's lower lip trembled as she looked from the monster on the floor to the man in the dark suit. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, her small hands still vibrating with a deep-seated chill. "It's not just me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming against the bar's windows. "There are others, in the big house with the boarded windows." Alessandro's eyes narrowed, his unreadable face tightening. "Others?" "They call it a foster home," Emily continued, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush now that the dam had broken. "But the people there, they don't love us. They take pictures of us. They make us wait in the basement for men to come and look at us. They told us if we ever left, the police would put us in jail. But I saw him hurt Lucy, and I had to run." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the iron gate. The lieutenants, men who had committed sins that would keep most awake at night, looked away, their jaws tight with a sudden, visceral disgust. This wasn't the business of the streets. This was a rot that defied even their darkened code. Alessandro remained perfectly still, but his hand, the one wearing the heavy gold signet ring, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. He realized now that this wasn't a simple case of a cruel guardian. This was a professional operation, a trafficking ring operating under the guise of state protection, hiding in the shadows of the very city he claimed to rule. He looked at Emily's tattered dress and the pure fear and innocence that still radiated from her wide eyes. The walls he had built around his heart 30 years ago didn't just crack, they groaned under the weight of a protective fury he hadn't felt since his own world was destroyed. He stood up slowly, his gaze returning to the man on the floor, who was now trying to crawl toward the exit. "A foster home," Alessandro repeated, the words tasting like poison. He looked to his lead lieutenant, a man named Marco. "Find out who owns that house. Find out who signs the papers. I want every name, every face, and every cent they've ever made." The predator's attempt to crawl toward the exit ended abruptly as Marco's heavy boot landed on his lower back, pinning him to the rain-slicked floorboards like a specimen under glass. Alessandro didn't look down. His focus was entirely on the room. For 15 years, his Tuesday routine had been as predictable as the tides. Accounts were settled, wine was poured, and the world outside was ignored. But as he looked at Emily, still trembling within the shadow of his chair, the rhythm of his empire shifted on its axis. With a sharp, nearly imperceptible nod, Alessandro gave the silent signal that every man in the room had been trained to recognize, but had hoped they would never see. It was the lockdown. "No one leaves the city," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. "Not by bridge, not by tunnel, and certainly not by the docks. If a car so much as slows down near that house on the boarded windows, I want to know the driver's blood type." The atmosphere in the iron gate transformed instantly. The low-humming business of the Mafia was replaced by the cold, mechanical efficiency of a war room. Men who had been sipping bourbon seconds ago were now on their feet, their faces hardening into masks of professional violence. Phones were lifted from their cradles, pagers buzzed against belts. The word was spreading through the New Jersey night like a virus. The boss was awake, and he was angry. Alessandro walked back to his table and picked up his glass, but he didn't drink. He poured the amber liquid onto the floor, a symbolic clearing of the slate. "Marco," he called out without turning around, "call the captains. Tell them the Tuesday meeting is over. Tell them we are no longer in the business of collections tonight. Tonight, we are in the business of cleaning house." The lieutenants moved with a synchronized urgency, disappearing into the rainy night to execute orders that would paralyze the local underworld. Alessandro remained in the center of the storm, a pillar of quiet danger. He looked at Emily and reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering for a moment before he gently patted her shoulder. "You did well to run, Piccola. The city is small, but my reach is long. By dawn, there will be nowhere left for them to hide." For the first time in 3 decades, Alessandro Duca wasn't protecting his profits or his pride. He was protecting a child, and in doing so, he had just declared war on the shadows of his own kingdom. The predator on the floor, a man who went by the name of Miller, had stopped trying to crawl. Under the weight of Marco's boot and the suffocating pressure of Alessandro's gaze, he had begun to leak information like a cracked faucet. He sobbed out the location of a discreet warehouse near the Newark docks, a gray, nondescript building where the foster father, the man who held the ledger and the keys to the children's cages, was waiting for the night's pickup. Alessandro didn't wait for a second confirmation. He gestured to 2 of his youngest associates, men who looked like Ivy League students but possessed the cold efficiency of sharks. "Take the girl to my estate. My personal physician is to meet her there. If she sheds a single tear because she feels unsafe, do not bother coming back to work." He watched as they gently led Emily toward a side exit, her small hand disappearing into the larger grip of a man sworn to die for her safety. As soon as the door clicked shut, the warmth in Alessandro's eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial, predatory focus. He grabbed his overcoat, the heavy wool draped over his shoulders like a shroud. "To the docks," he commanded. The motorcade moved through the rain-slicked streets of New Jersey like a funeral procession of black steel. They bypassed the main thoroughfares, carving a path through the industrial heart of the city, where the streetlights were sparse and the shadows were long. Alessandro sat in the back of the lead car, his hands folded over his silver-headed cane. He wasn't thinking about territory or profit. He was thinking about the boarded windows Emily had described. They arrived at the warehouse, a jagged silhouette of corrugated metal against the dark Atlantic. It was a place designed to be forgotten, tucked between a scrapyard and a condemned pier. As the black SUVs glided to a halt, their headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating a single, rusted loading bay door. Alessandro stepped out of the car, the rain instantly matting his hair, but he didn't flinch. He watched as his men moved with tactical silence, flanking the building and cutting the external phone lines. They found the foster father's car parked in the rear, the engines still warm. Inside, a single light flickered through a high, dirt-streaked window. "Marco," Alessandro whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing surf. "Break the door, but leave the one in charge to me. I want him to see exactly whose world he tried to hide in." The steel door gave way with a screech of tortured metal, echoing through the hollow cavern of the warehouse. Alessandro stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete, a stark contrast to the chaotic splashing of the rain outside. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of mildew, old grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of terror. At the center of the room, under a single buzzing fluorescent bulb, stood the man who called himself the director, the foster father who had turned a sanctuary into a marketplace. He was a thin, balding man with wire-rimmed glasses that slid down his nose as he turned, his face pale with the realization that the night had finally caught up to him. Behind him, several heavy-set thugs reached for weapons, but they froze as Alessandro's men swarmed the catwalks above, red laser dots dancing across the villains' chests like lethal fireflies. Who are you?" the director stammered, clutching a leather ledger to his chest as if it could shield him. Alessandro didn't answer immediately. He walked toward a heavy wooden table where a stack of photographs lay, pictures of children, including Emily, marked with prices and dates. He picked one up, his unreadable face tightening as he looked at the girl's forced smile. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the photo in half. "I am the man who allows you to breathe the air in this city, and tonight I am revoking that privilege." The director tried to find his voice, his arrogance replaced by a high-pitched whine. "This is a business, DeLuca. We have people in the department, people in the city hall. You can't just—" Alessandro moved with a speed that defied his age. In one blur of motion, he grabbed the man by the throat and slammed him against the cold brick wall, the ledger falling to the floor with a heavy thud. Alessandro leaned in close, the scent of his expensive cigar smoke filling the man's lungs. "You speak of business," Alessandro hissed, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. "In my world, we deal in many things. We deal in vice, in power, and in blood. But we do not deal in the souls of children. There are lines, even in the dark, that must never be crossed." He looked at the other men in the room, his gaze promising a slow and painful end to anyone who moved. "You thought because you operated in the shadows of the law you were safe, but you forgot that the shadows belong to me." With a flick of his wrist, Alessandro threw the man toward Marco. "Burn the ledger, record the names of the buyers, then—" He paused, his voice dropping to a final, lethal whisper. "Show them exactly what happens to those who hunt the innocent in my city." The warehouse was still echoing with the terrified pleas when Alessandro stepped back into the rain, but his work was far from finished. For a man like DeLuca, true destruction wasn't achieved with a gun. It was achieved by erasing the enemy's very existence. As the black SUV sped away from the docks, Alessandro opened his sleek, leather-bound phone and began to make the calls that would dismantle the ring's invisible armor. His first call was to a judge whose gambling debts had been quietly settled by the DeLuca family years ago. His second was to a high-ranking official in the Department of Children and Families who owed his career to Alessandro's quiet influence. "The house with the boarded windows," Alessandro said, his voice as cold and precise as a winter frost. "By dawn, I want the deed revoked, the licenses shredded, and the names of every accomplice on my desk. If a single file remains in the system that links Emily Carter to that hellhole, I will consider it a personal insult." Back at his study, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the quiet scratching of a pen. Alessandro didn't just want the traffickers gone, he wanted Emily to be born again into a world where they could never find her. He watched as his lawyers worked through the night, filing injunctions and sealing records with a speed that only Mafia-backed pressure could command. They scrubbed the digital footprints of her foster placement and buried the trauma of her flight under mountains of legal iron. By 4 a.m., the clean slate was nearly complete. The corrupt officials who had taken bribes to look the other way were being picked up by internal affairs, pushed by anonymous tips that carried Alessandro's unmistakable weight. The paper trail that had turned children into commodities was being fed into industrial shredders, and the bank accounts tied to the director were being drained to fund a secret trust for the survivors. Alessandro sat behind his desk, watching the sun begin to bleed over the New Jersey skyline. He looked at a final document, a clean, official birth certificate, and a set of adoption papers with the state seal already pressed into the wax. The DeLuca Code had always been about protection through fear, but tonight he had used that fear to build a fortress around a single, innocent life. Emily Carter no longer existed as a runaway or a victim. On paper, she was a ghost, and in reality, she was finally free. 6 months had passed since the rain-slicked night Emily Carter crashed through the doors of the Iron Gate, and the world she left behind was unrecognizable. The warehouse at the docks was a hollowed-out shell. The Foster network had been surgically excised from the city's records, and the men who had preyed on the innocent had vanished into the silent, permanent shadows of the New Jersey marshlands. On a bright, crisp morning that felt worlds away from the darkness of his usual domain, Alessandro Duca sat in the back of his black sedan, parked a discreet distance from a colonial-style house with a wide front porch. He didn't wear his overcoat today, but his presence still radiated that same quiet, unreadable power. Through the tinted glass, he watched as a young girl in a bright, clean red dress, one that wasn't tattered or stained by the city's grime, ran across the lawn. Emily looked different. The pure fear and innocence that had once defined her expression had been replaced by a radiant, effortless joy. She was chasing a golden retriever, her laughter drifting faintly through the air, a sound so pure it seemed to physically push back the weight of Alessandro's many sins. A woman came out onto the porch, smiling as she called Emily's name, and a man followed, lifting the girl into the air with a playful spin. This was the family Alessandro's connections had vetted with the scrutiny of a high-level hit, people of warmth, integrity, and genuine love. Alessandro watched them for a long time, his hand resting on the heavy gold signet ring that had once symbolized only his iron-fisted rule. He had lived his life by the code that sentiment was a weakness, but as he saw Emily's new father set her down and ruffle her hair, he realized he had been wrong. His intervention hadn't been a moment of frailty, it had been his greatest display of strength. He signaled to Marco in the driver's seat. There was no need for words, no need for a tearful goodbye. He was a creature of the dark, and she was a child of the light. Their worlds were never meant to stay merged. But as the car pulled slowly away from the curb, Alessandro felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He would always be the beast in the suit, the man who ruled through fear and quiet danger, but for one little girl, he would be forever the invisible guardian who had traded his cold isolation for the chance to save a soul. The city still whispered his name in terror, but Emily would grow up in a world where the monsters were gone, never knowing that the most dangerous man of all was the one who had set her free.